Winter is coming. Doctoral supervision in the neoliberal university. A presentation by Tara Brabazon. The reputation of our universities is dependent on the calibre and the excellence of our doctoral programs. But this excellence is often based on rudimentary, everyday interactions between students and supervisors. But it is clear that the relationship between a supervisor and a student is the determinant of a successful PhD. But the bigger question is, what does success in a doctoral program mean or look like? It could be a timely completion, it could be an exciting or an exhilarating candidature, it could also be the gaining of publishing or teaching experience during that candidature. But how can we gain these experiences? Well, Hockey's research from 1995 explored the notion of over and under supervision. The problem with thinking through over and under supervision is that that status and state is determined personally, professionally, and also institutionally. In other words, it changes. The best supervision, though, is supervision, the capacity to see the arc of a candidature, but also provide the guide on the side once the examination is complete. Every supervisor can be excellent. Every supervisor can kill a thesis. Every student can be successful. Every student can walk away from a seemingly outstanding thesis. The diversity of student projects, expectations, and most importantly, the calibre of an institution's administration, management, and leadership strategies needs to be understood. Globalisation has certainly left its fingertips on doctoral education, but with stark unevenness. The Bologna process has traction, has authority, has credibility. The North American coursework model still dominates that continent, and much to my shame, most Australian universities still do not have an oral examination at the conclusion of a candidature. So these international conversations really do matter. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today from Australia, and a big shout out and hi to all my colleagues at Delft. So for my presentation today, I want to summon and acknowledge a really outstanding book that I think has really been underplayed in the literature. This book has been edited by Lynn McAlpine and Cheryl Amundsen. It's published in 2011 by Springer, and it's titled Doctoral Education, Research-Based Strategies for Research Students, Supervisors and Administrators. I recommend this book to you. And they argue that, quote, the experience of doctoral education is very much locally situated in day-to-day interactions, end of quote. Therefore, in this presentation today, I want to probe those day-to-day interactions and ask, like a canary in a mine, what they reveal about contemporary higher education. The title of my presentation today, Winter is Coming, is derived from Game of Thrones, and I have used that reference with intent. Game of Thrones as a literary and as a televisual saga captures the passion for power and the ruthlessness to achieve it. So these multiple games of power in our contemporary university, the jostling, the intrigue, the rumour, the horror, the bullying, are ruthless in their application. Therefore, the subtitle of my presentation, Doctoral Supervision in the Neoliberal University, provides a guide through the lies, the fabrications and the horrors that we are starting to take for granted in our day-to-day interactions. I particularly want to assess the cost of these practices and processes on our students and on our supervisors. As Littlefinger tells Lord Varus, quote, chaos isn't a pit, chaos is a ladder, end of quote. Therefore, my presentation today for the European University Association offers 10 diagnostic tools to understand the challenges to and for doctoral education. But I want to also provide a ladder to a stable experience for our students, our supervisors, and our universities. Diagnostic 1. negotiate expectations. The Lannisters remind us to understand the rules by which the game is played, and doctoral education really is the same. The most important decision that a PhD student will make, the most important one, is the selection of supervisor, because they can enable, assist and frame the subject, but also provide that trajectory, that advice, that care post the PhD. The most important part of a PhD is, I think, the first month, where the expectations of the candidature is expressed overtly and clearly. And I've used avert there intentionally, because I think one of the greatest problems that exist in PhD supervision is the unspoken assumptions, assuming that the student and the supervisor both agree on what they're talking about, and often that's simply not the case. It's got to be based on honesty, respect and integrity. Ensure that the supervisor maintains and can express a supervisory philosophy, and that is shared with the student. Expect the supervisor to read, edit, look at, discuss and work through the writing of the thesis, and offer that concrete advice about reading, about shaping ideas and about scholarship. Anthony Parr articulated very clearly that, quote, in a very real sense, doctoral supervisors are writing teachers, end of quote. Therefore, students shouldn't be embarrassed, shouldn't be reticent to ask for help. Doctoral education requires the deployment of discipline-specific writing modalities. This is an intimate and intense set of tutorials that exist over the entire arc of the PhD, and students must feel empowered enough to ask for the help that they require. Academic integrity is a key phrase in education at the moment. Plagiarism is a bit of a folk devil, but when the phrase academic integrity is used, I like that in a university, because it means we can have an adult conversation about the ownership of words. Does a supervisor demand co-authorship of a student's work? That, for me, is one of the key questions of our time. If that co-authorship matter is not agreed, then change the terms of the contract at the start, or indeed change the supervisor. That's how important this issue is. Agree to the frequency of meetings, the mode of discourse within those meetings, how digitisation is to be deployed in those meetings, and it's always wise to commence a candidature considering its ending. Discuss the challenges and the hurdles that may emerge throughout the candidature. Talk through examination, the timing, who perhaps could be examiners, and make that key decision to finish in the minimum time. Do not make assumptions that a student and a supervisor will agree on key issues. That's always a mistake. Do not make an assumption that the management of a university cares at all about doctoral education or has any expertise in that area. Jonathan Rutherford articulated so clearly what he believed were the key changes happening to higher education at the moment, but also the problems when we don't discuss the assumptions that we think we share with other people. He stated, quote, there is a paradox. Changes are occurring faster in people's consciousness than in their behaviour or social conditions, end of quote. So in other words, neoliberal ideologies are framing our institution. They're changing our consciousness, but our behaviour about the importance of refereeing, scholarship, academic integrity, our patterns of behaviour continue, even though the consciousness does not. So discuss the assumptions. Diagnostic 2. Is there an advocate for graduate education and doctoral students? Graduate education makes money for the contemporary university and attracts international students, but frequently it is invisible until something goes wrong. So there's been a quality assurance breach, or there's some damage from the doctoral program that may impact more widely on the university's branding and marketing. But graduate education is different, and it is important because it exposes the lie of the contemporary university that it is a business like any other, a business like grocery, like real estate, like banking. Therefore, the managers in our post-expertise universities mask, decentre and demean doctoral education because it's the one area of our contemporary university that demands intellectual integrity. This credibility must be earned, not bullied or imagined into existence. And a Dean of Graduate Studies is a specialist and distinctive role. It's unusual because the person in that role must be both an outstanding teacher and an outstanding researcher. He or she must also manage a department, manage staff, manage finances, but also understand and apply international standards of scholarship and look after graduate students and their supervisors. But conditions at the moment are not very kind for these deans of doctoral programs. Neoliberal management is a futile reality of most of the universities in which we work. Assumptions about the rationality of economics and the logic of the market means that we lack the analytical tools to understand the shape and the texture of the events that are unfolding around us. The assumptions of growth and rationality in capitalism is an ideology that widens both injustice and inequality. Colin Kremlin's work is incredibly important here because he takes on the futility of this system and argues that indeed the global financial crisis was predictable. Perhaps he was right. Importantly, the neglect, the disrespect and marginalisation of regulation and governance provided the context for the financial collapse to emerge in 2008-9. What has now happened is austerity, that profoundly important word after the global financial crisis, has signalled the next stage of neoliberalism, the next stage of anti-statism. The point of using the word austerity is to blame those who were and who are blameless. For our doctoral students and our academics considering enrolling and working in a particular university, for me it's incredibly important that you research with care and a lot of rigour the university's head of faculties. Now these posts used to be called deans, they're now called executive deans, sometimes they're called pro-vice-chancellors. But ask the difficult questions of the people in those roles. Are those men and women research active? Do they publish regularly? Are they scholars? Look at their resumes, look at their publications. If little has been achieved or published, and success for them is measured by the most rudimentary of words that's often called restructuring, which is changing a system that was already working pretty well, then pretend you're on Tinder and swipe left ruthlessly and quickly. Remember Lord Varys's words from Game of Thrones. Power resides where men believe it resides. It is a trick, a shadow on the wall, and a very small man can cast a very large shadow. There are many small men and small women in our universities, and an executive dean said to me only 6 weeks ago, quote, "Leadership in universities is not about content expertise," end of quote. Well, when I was a girl, content was called knowledge, and knowledge is actually the point of our universities. It is what we do. So doctoral programs must be based on knowledge, scholarship, excellence and expertise. Do not believe a shadow on a wall. Diagnostic 3. Recognise that neoliberal university structures are selfish and narcissistic. One of the consequences of neoliberalism is a self-absorbed focus on the individual, and that can take the attention away from the collegial development of knowledge, the community of scholars. Individual achievement absolutely is important, but it is now at the detriment to wider competencies, expertise and quality in research. So for example, tenure in North America is based on the development of publications. The REF in the UK, the ERA in Australia are research monitoring activities for staff. So staff are being patrolled and monitored in their research. Now these systems encourage processes where staff exploit their doctoral students to snake their way into doctoral publications. Sometimes this exploitative process is called mentoring, but this is often a mask, I think, for the rapid and often very destructive colonisation of junior scholars' work. All prospective doctoral students should consider and talk about authorship at the moment of enrolment. Ask what a supervisor gains from supervising that doctoral student and get an answer that you're happy with. Assess if and how a university respects collegiality, intellectual generosity. If university leadership is appearing straight out of the second season of Game of Thrones, mobilising metaphoric armies to become king or queen, then move to another institution. Higher education is not meant to be like this. We have allowed neoliberalism to value and validate competition over quality. Ranking of institutions, often on the basis of completely arbitrary determinants, is now becoming a supposed replacement for professionalism and respectful environments. But always remember that supervisors and students make a choice every single day. We can all choose every day to behave ethically and well and with respect. As Wildling reminded, quote, "People work together when it suits them. They're loyal when it suits them. They love each other when they suit them. And they kill each other when it suits them." Make sure that both the student and the supervisor gain something from the supervisory relationship, but also make sure that if something goes wrong in this competitive time, that the institutional structures are able to move into that situation and support the student, the disempowered person in that relationship. Diagnostic 4. Demand research activity from PhD supervisors. A senior staff member once said to me, in fact it was only a few months ago, that I expect too much from PhD supervisors. But for me, the baseline of doctoral supervision must be individual research activity. And each institution has many different ways of assessing research activity. Often the baseline is as low as one refereed article a year. And often that refereed article can be co-written. So for some universities, that is the definition of research activity. But my argument is that doctoral candidates have the right to demand that their supervisor is assessed by referees, that every single year the calibre of their scholarship is checked through referees, through the refereeing process. Therefore, research activity must be transparent and it must be shared with both prospective and actual PhD students. The challenge, though, is that doctoral candidates are increasingly sucked into the research activity and expectations of their PhD supervisors. Bit weird. So in other words, particularly in the sciences, an excuse for an academic not being research active is that they don't have PhD students. So this is the paradox, you see. I'm not research active because I don't have doctoral students, yet you need doctoral students to be research active. All of that is actually a displacement exercise. Even in the laboratory-based sciences, there's a suite of publications that can be enacted without doctoral candidates. I'm thinking discussions of research ethics, meta-analyses of previous data sets, but also SOTL, the scholarship of teaching and learning. So if a staff member wanted to get to that minimal level of compliance, there are many ways to do that without PhD students. So I think we need to remember that PhD supervision is a privilege. It's not a right, and it's a privilege that is enacted through being research active. It is, as McAlpine and Almondson described it, quote, a form of workplace learning, end of quote. So our goal is to enable identity development from both PhD students, but also supervisors. Diagnostic 5, governance versus autonomy for supervisors. For me, the greatest challenge that exists in the neoliberal university for graduate education is maintaining the balance between believing in the autonomy of supervisors and ensuring that structures are in place, governance structures are in place to protect students. It is important, incredibly important, to believe in and trust the professionalism of supervisors. Therefore, supervisors should maintain training in best international practice for doctoral education and professional development on topics such as social media, digital supervision, and be assessed annually by refereeing and refereed scholarship. A supervisory register, I think, is a good, solid compliance mechanism for supervisors. It is a welcome one because it guarantees a certain level of minimal standards for our students. And really, it is a reminder, I think, that a university at its best is a learning environment. I always remember the phrase that the Vice-Chancellor at City University, Paul Curran, used. He said he wanted, quote, our students to learn from academics who are themselves learning, end of quote. So from this foundation of excellence, autonomy is the right of supervisors to determine the learning and teaching parameter for their students, absolutely. But the problem we've got is a lot goes wrong in the supervisory relationship. Supervisors leave, supervisors neglect students, and of course there are the challenges that emerge from students themselves. They stop reading, they stop answering emails, they don't come to meetings for weeks or months. So when the problems hit, that is when we require governance structures to maintain, if you like, that framework for negotiation and for change. It brings supervisors and students together if something goes astray. Each institution manages that balance between autonomy and governance in different ways. And while I think very often students are over-administered with far too many forms, the alternative of no governance or regulation so that students are simply at the mercy of their supervisor is also not a viable option. As Littlefinger reminded us, quote, sometimes those with the most power have the least grace. End of quote. Supervisors must start with personal excellence, but successful supervision is powered by intellectual generosity. Diagnostic 6. Beware the PhD by prior publication. Currently there are 5 modes of doctorate that are available in our university. The traditional doctorate, the artefact and exegesis, the professional doctoral suite, the PhD by prior publication, and the PhD by publication. Now, the PhD by prior publication had a particular origin, cause and impetus. As an array of polytechnic and non-university institutions started to gain university status, a way had to be found to credential their staff and validate the research that they'd already completed. So the PhD by prior publication provided that pathway and that gateway, and it was of particular use to men and to women whose careers had been interrupted in some way, particularly by children. Therefore, this mode of doctorate was a fixer for many of the challenges and issues emerging in the university sector in the early 1990s. The key issue to remember is that the PhD by prior publication is very, very different from the PhD by publication. They are different in form, content, origin, and output. But the PhD by prior publication was understandable in the particular context of higher education in the early 1990s, and these days it's a very rare mode of doctoral enrolment. But the PhD by publication is fueled by a very different set of arguments. The candidate has not produced any research before the enrolment, and the argument is that a series of articles can be produced during the candidature that can be brought together and submitted as a doctorate. Remember, refereed publication, refereed scholarship and doctorates are actually different things. They're different in genre, they're different in mode, they're different in regulation, they're different in audience. The justification for the PhD by prior publication is we're living in an increasingly competitive university environment. It's difficult to get jobs, and if our PhD students have articles, then they have a greater chance of getting a job. Now, there's no argument that PhD students should be producing refereed scholarship. The question for me is whether that refereed scholarship is actually a PhD. That's the key. There are some under-researched problems emerging in the PhD by publication. Firstly, supervisors are exploiting their postgraduate students, citing the Vancouver Protocol that was in existence 20 years ago to handle authorship in medical science journals. And that's used to justify supervisors and students sharing publications and sharing authorship of those publications. So instead of a PhD student writing a doctorate and then able to publish from that doctorate in their own name, candidates write articles during their enrolment and share authorship with their supervisors. Now, I know an array of supervisors these days who only agree to supervise PhD by publication. They demand that enrolment to feather their own nest and increase their own publications. Intriguingly though, after an initial burst of enrolments in this mode for those supervisors, they're now finding it rather difficult to find students. There are many reasons for this, but prospective doctoral students, I think, have worked out the ruse of this particular mode of enrolment. This practice of supervision is concerning and it is under-regulated. One supervisor by PhD by publication reported to me that she needed to confirm that a student was granting her co-authorship before she would even open up the file and read it for her. Now, please note, this staff member receives a workload, that is money, payment for the supervision of that student. So they are paid to supervise the student. They gain the credibility on their CV through the completed doctorate, and now they're also demanding co-authorship. So this is triple dipping, and it is of great detriment to our PhD students. Our PhD students are becoming unpaid research assistants for their supervisors. Secondly, if the conversation is framed in terms of enabling doctoral students to produce publications, then the reality of that goal is much more uncertain. So while publications may be produced during the doctorate, the legacy publications, the legacy research after it, is much more volatile and uncertain. So this leaves students with no momentum in their research following graduation. Their research has been published and therefore they have to start again in their new research future. And I've recently spent several hours trying to help a newly minted PhD student who's graduated PhD by publication, who produced that PhD by publication with 5 co-authored articles. So that's all she's got, 5 co-authored articles, and now she must build a research career without any legacy publication possible from that PhD. She had no idea to write on or what to do next. And I'll just show you the scale of the difference of what we are dealing with. Here is my PhD, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. This is my PhD, that's what it looked like, published at Murdoch University. Note perhaps just the size. So the size will do at this juncture. Passed without correction though, so it must have been all right. That's a traditional PhD. Here is a PhD by publication, submitted last year. So if you need any understanding of whether or not these modes of doctorate are equivalent, just start with the size, the breadth, the spectrum of the research that's being created, and then ask the important questions about quality soon after that. So if students are considering a PhD by publication, ensure that they receive a full and a frank briefing about the benefits of it, but also the profound negativities in the short, medium and long term, and also that robust conversations are had about the ownership of their work and the importance of authorship. Diagnostic 7. The importance of a rapid PhD completion. Beginnings matter, but my goodness me, endings matter more. It's very important to move into a doctoral program, move into a supervision, aiming for a rapid and successful candidature. So the goal is, in the first couple of months, ensure that a very tight and succinct thesis is configured. Clear research questions, clear parameters of research, an understanding of the important theoretical debates occurring at the moment, but be very clear about what is not in the thesis right at the start of the thesis. Cut away as much of the fat of the thesis as you can as early as possible. I'm aware that's difficult in empirical projects, particularly involving field work, but the best of supervisors are able to stop their students going into completely unnecessary cul-de-sacs that simply chew up, burn up time. The key is to maintain that motivation and that focus on completion. The reason we're here, the point of the whole exercise, is to enable that completion. The longer the candidature, the less likely the student is to finish. A characteristic of students who do not complete is they take a very long time in their candidature. The longer you go, the less likely you are to finish. Therefore, the goals right at the start should be succinct and should be clear, creating milestones and rapid progress through to completion. Stability matters in that supervisory process. Predictability, the easiness of the relationship between the supervisor and the student is what makes that rapid completion. Ensure that the university infrastructure does not support a supervisor endlessly re-enrolling a student session after session after session. Some systems actually encourage long candidatures because of the way in which workload is allocated. So be careful of that. Ensure that the system rewards the men and women who get students through in quick time, and that enables the student to get on with their lives, whether it be professional and personal, and move on post-PhD. Diagnostic 8. Ask the difficult questions about a PhD supervisor's university contract. The neoliberal university is volatile, and Guy Standing's precariat now staffs higher education. We are in a post-tenure environment. This has many challenges in terms of academic freedom and the development of research cultures, but has a profound impact on PhD students. With tenure in place, students can move from first year working with a staff member right the way through to doctoral supervision. They can develop new knowledge together. Similarly, a student could make a decision to move their lives, move their families, to work with that one special person, and again create brand new, shiny, interdisciplinary, fabulous knowledge. But the nature of these short-term contracts means that the supervisors are simply not employed for the length of the candidature. This is an under-researched and new problem in higher education. The lack of research expertise in academic managers means that the needs of PhD students are much lower on the pecking order than short-termism in the managing of one-line budgets. This means that students will not have a continuity of supervision, and this is profoundly problematic because one characteristic of students that don't finish is that they change supervisors. Without that continuity of contracts, students are going to have this bizarre jump-cut supervision that will not only impact greatly on students, but also on completion rates. Stanley Arnowitz wrote The Knowledge Factory, fantastic book, in the year 2000. And his argument was that a management class, group, stream or tier was being formed. These were the men and the women who had failed in teaching, who had failed in research, and had moved to management to enact power on those who have been successful in the spheres in which they had failed. Through the subsequent 16 years since that book was published and built on the sociology of higher education, universities are now a shell of conformity, of compliance and mediocrity. A higher education establishment has been infected by the practices and the procedures that exist in banks, that exist in corporations, and the group that is most impacted by this anti-intellectual wind, and the group that is less able to express their rage, express their disgust, express the profound consequences on themselves, are of course doctoral students and their supervisors. So students must ask that really difficult question. Will the supervisor who is assisting them at the start of the candidature be the supervisor to enable them to completion? Diagnostic 9. Doctoral programs should be sustainable. A PhD program should be in a healthy state upon the student's arrival, but don't think just because you're not entering a burning building that you'll be able to complete the thesis and the reputation of the university from which you graduate will remain intact. It's important to look for credibility, integrity and sustainability. And those types of programs are maintained through integrity, respect and care, rather than exploitation and short-termism. That's why the Dean of Graduate Studies is such an important role, because he or she is a curator for the program, nurturing and caring for the regulations, caring for the students, caring for the supervisor. And this type of credibility does matter in doctoral education. Therefore, it's important to review the institution's statistics on an array of variables, like the number of postgraduate students, the speed of completion, but also the failure rate. Now, failures are rare in doctoral education, but when you review those statistics, assess whether or not they're clustered in particular disciplines, schools, or departments. Be clear, be careful, and also ensure that students meet already existing doctoral candidates and know their supervisor well before they commence their enrolment. Do not enter a burning building of a doctoral program and think that the fire will only do damage to students after you've graduated. Diagnostic 10. Use the technology and consider a post-geographical supervisory relationship. The more regular students meet their supervisors, the more likely they are to finish. The more regular the meetings, the faster the candidature. But while the experience of doctoral education, including meeting students on campus, having cups of coffee with supervisors, all of that is incredibly valuable, there are new, innovative and digital ways to think about supervision, and we should be considering them. The key is to ensure that synchronous supervisory meetings are held weekly if possible, and it doesn't matter too much if those meetings are analogue or digital. An array of social connections can be created through Facebook, academia.edu, LinkedIn and Twitter. You can meet new students, you can meet your supervisor, you can also explore and dialogue directly with researchers who have influenced you. Deterritorialisation, the cutting away of physical space, is now a reality for doctoral candidatures. But it's also matched by disintermediation. So students can contact researchers, writers, their supervisors in an array of ways that were not possible even 5 years ago. So the most innovative universities are starting to use Adobe Connect or Skype to create virtual coffee shops, virtual spaces for students to meet, and also virtual writing boot camps as well, which are proving very, very beneficial. It's also valuable to have a podcast or vodcast library of information training facilities that are available in a just-in-time basis for students, so it can enliven and enrich their candidature in and on a time that suits them. The key for me is to focus on synchronous meetings with supervisors, to create micro deadlines for the completion of work, and then deploy an array of asynchronous resources that keep the candidature fresh, enlivening, enriching, and passionate. Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones reminded us that people learn to love their chains. End of quote. The trust between supervisor and postgraduate is integral to doctoral education, and if exploitation and bullying and harassment enter into that space, then the hopes, the passions, the dreams of our doctoral students are destroyed. But there is a greater cost. Our universities themselves are cheapened. We are judged by how we treat the weakest in our community as much as the strongest. It is important that we start to cut those chains that tether postgraduate students to those supervisors. We have to cut the chains. We have to build ladders. These ladders will ensure that the next generation of scholars will continue to fight with passion, with excitement, with energy, and with rigour, rather than being lost in conformity, compliance, and mediocrity.